so much, Amy, and thank you everybody for coming out. It's so great to see you all here, especially on this cold night. We appreciate the whoops. Keep them coming. We're gonna do some rambling about the book and tell you, both how we got here into this book and how we got here in the situation with fire as a society. And to start things off, Justin's going to read a little bit from the book. So take it away, Justin.
Yeah, a little bit from the opening of the book. One day next summer, a lightning bolt will strike an old ponderosa pine, or a gust of wind will send a power line to the ground, or a car will light up some vegetation on an overgrown double-track road. A train will send off a spark. The burning entrails of a fire will rain down on the juniper. Someone will take a lighter to a blade of grass. There's no way to eliminate fire, but we can mitigate its severity and how it affects us. Doing that requires thinking long-term. It requires changing ourselves and our homes and engaging with the world around us and our neighbors in ways we might not have considered before. Fire season is at least 80 days longer now than it was 30 years ago. By the end of the century, experts anticipate extreme fire events to rise by 50% across the world. That means flames will burn bigger areas during more parts of the year, from temperate grasslands to tropical savanna to tundra, in Australia, Greece, the Amazon, Indonesia, the Arctic, and beyond. We've mobilized an army to fight a never-ending war on fire. Yet we build deeper into areas ready to go up in flames. And we keep ramping up our burning of fossil fuels, contributing to the warming of our planet and making conditions ripe for bigger, more extreme blazes. We're at a precarious moment for wildfire in the United States. We can keep thinking about these conflagrations the same way, or we can change course. The question driving this book is, how can we recognize both truths of wildfire? It threatens and destroys so much of what we love, our homes, livelihoods, mental state, our very ability to breathe. But it's also a process that's completely natural. It rejuvenates forests and ecosystems. Fire has burned across the earth longer than our species has walked the planet. How do we live in a world with fire? How do we manage it? And how do we manage ourselves?
Thank you, Justin. So, because there's two of us, this isn't going to be an ordinary lecture. We don't want to lecture you guys about anything. So we're going to ask each other questions. We want to hear from you all as well. But to start out, Justin, why don't you talk about how you got interested in the love of fire in the first place?
Yeah, it might be curious listening to my bio as a business school professor. What on earth is this guy doing? Thinking about fire, writing a book about fire, and masquerading as a journalist, too. Nick probably bounces whenever he hears that term applied to me. So, I think as an academic, you're kind of trained to learn more and more about less and less. You're trained to write papers that are pretty narrow in their focus that not many people read. Yet you have a skill set of curiosity and trying to share with students in the broader world important ideas that matter. And fire, when I moved to Montana in 2012, it became immediately clear that this is a hugely important issue that matters to this place and beyond. And it was my first time kind of dealing with it and living in it. And it was a particularly bad smoke year. Worried about our young children. All sorts of things were new. And I also learned quickly that in Missoula, we're kind of at an epicenter for wildfire. There's amazing fire science happening. There's incredible firefighting, the Smoke Jumper Training Center, Smoke Jumper Base, National Fire Lab, amazing colleagues at the College of Forestry and Conservation. So all these rock stars of fire were all around me, and I was getting to know them. And it also seemed that the public didn't really have a good understanding of the work they did. And so in the process of setting out to understand their work myself, I sort of thought that doing something to explain this issue to folks like me that knew nothing about it, and then folks in the community that wanted to learn more, there was a need there. And it quickly became apparent that it was a task that was beyond my skill set, and I needed to team up with an actual journalist like Nick and our collaborator on Fireline podcast, a student at the time named Victor Iveas, who's become a great journalist in his own right. He works for Bloomberg now. And the three of us made Fireline in 2021, and it was an awesome experience. Met so many cool people in the fire space, and were able to reach a lot of people around the country and illuminate this issue to people that maybe were curious. And one of the people that was curious was Anton Mueller from Bloomsbury Publishing, and he reached out to Nick about the possibility of making a book as an extension of this project. So I think, well, I don't want to speak for you necessarily, Nick, but both of us thought, like, wow, a book sounds like kind of a daunting lift, but maybe we could do it together. We did this together, maybe we could do a book together, and it turned out that we were able to do it. So, thank you, Nick. Well, how did you get it?
Well, yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City, in an area where I did not spend a lot of time outside, and it was very disconnected from wildfire. Like, historically, the region would have had a lot of wildfire in the prairie, but that had been severed through development, segmentation of habitat, and fire suppression. I didn't learn that until years and years after I moved away. But when I did move away after college, I moved west to do some conservation work, and I was doing an AmeriCorps job, so like making next to no money for the government, Catherine knows what I'm talking about, and so I was doing a lot of habitat restoration and trail building, and the first 3 months I was restoring sage-grouse habitat, which meant actually felling pinyons and junipers that had encroached because of fire suppression. I was told I was, in essence, simulating the effect of what natural wildfire would have done to restore this habitat that had been degraded because trees that would have ordinarily been burnt, had we not suppressed fires, were taking over this habitat. And I went on to do a lot of fuels reduction and other work in that space, and also experienced my first actual wildfires too. I saw plumes starting in the distance, and we called our project partner and be like, "Should we be out here?" And he was like, "Yes, keep working." And so I became fascinated with the West and with wildfire, and I never left. And ended up realizing that I wanted to tell stories. Went to grad school for journalism and reported on wildfire a good bit. And then the opportunity to work with Justin on Fireline came along, and so the opportunity for the book. But really, this sort of experience trying to simulate the effect of wildfire on a really small scale planted that seed in my head of like, what situation have we gotten ourselves in here? Is this, and how do we get ourselves out of it? That has never left me, because wildfire is so complicated and so complex. And maybe also just out of curiosity in this room, like how many people have, either through fighting fire, living through a fire, losing property, anything like that, how many people here have had direct experience with wildfire?
Yeah, almost everyone.
That's wild. Yeah. Anybody want to share a story? Anybody?
It's like what, 2 or 3 years? Yeah. But like our entire town, Estes Park, Colorado, where we're from, was evacuated due to 2 of the largest fires in the state's history. Two different sides of the state.
He has an incredible picture too. I was the next town over where it caught. I was in Mott.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we saw the flames start coming up over the hill.
Yep.
Anybody else?
We had a restoration site burst into flames while we were monitoring it. We had to evacuate, and then we've been able to monitor that site for several years after the fire, just to see how it has just rejuvenated itself.
So that's so interesting, because we've heard sort of 2 different aspects of fire here. We've heard fire as this scary, destructive thing, which it often is, and fire as this thing that can rejuvenate the landscape, which is something we don't hear as often about, but is as equally important. And so many of you are already so familiar with fire, you might already know some of this stuff, but I should also talk about how we got ourselves into this mess in the first place. So Justin, why don't you take that away?
Sure. A lot of the history sort of stems from the Great Burn, the Big Burn, chronicled wonderfully in Tim Egan's book, The Big Burn. 1910, some of you probably know this story. A series of small fires comes together in the Northwest, northern Idaho, western Montana, eastern Washington, southern BC, and 3 million acres are burned in a couple of days. And at the time, the Forest Service was this fledgling organization constituted underneath the Department of Agriculture. And they saw the timber resource as one that we need to protect. Right? It's a monetizable natural resource that we need to protect. And that set in motion a almost military-style apparatus to control and snuff out all fires. The 10 a.m. rule was put into place that any fire detected needed to be snuffed out by 10 a.m. the following morning, and a lot of institutional inertia was developed around that, coinciding with sort of a cultural sentiment of we can bend nature to our will, better living through chemistry and engineering in this period of history in our country where we just tried to control everything, including fire. We got really good at controlling fire. And even as the science started to reveal that, hey, maybe putting out all these fires isn't such a great idea, maybe there's ecological consequences that we haven't accounted for, it was still hard, and it is still hard for us to embrace that science, for us to allow fire to play its natural role on certain landscapes, and to not be hell-bent on putting out all fires at all times. And that goes back to the tension that Nick illuminated a few moments ago. Fire is this essential part of ecosystems, but it's also this terribly scary thing that causes tremendous loss for many of us. Many folks in this room have experienced loss. So how do we reconcile those two things? And we're still fighting with that, and this book is an attempt to sort of see our way through that tension.
Yeah, and a couple other things to inform that. It doesn't really inform that, but number one is the illustrations you're seeing, we should point out, are by our illustrator Jesse Stevenson, who did a whole bunch of really incredible work, and you'll see some blown up versions of the screen here. We just want to give her a shout out and really make sure that her work can get seen in all its glory. If you happen to be in Missoula a week from tomorrow, next Friday, we're doing the first Friday event where her art will be displayed at Imagination Brewery. And I think we're doing another one at the Dram Shop in
in the
February.
spring. It'll be February or March. Yeah.
Cool. But the other thing to add to this is that fire wasn't always an enemy. Wildfire's been around much longer than people have been around. Much, much, much longer than people have been around. Fire, in a lot of ways, made us what we are. Fire, there's a wonderful anthropologist named Richard Wrangham who theorized that fire helped us cook food, which enabled us to consume the energy we needed for our brains to grow. And indigenous people lived with fire for centuries, for millennia, utilized fire to manipulate landscapes. And historical records show that indigenous people had huge impacts on ecosystems across the country through their use of fire. And as soon as the Big Burn happened, 10 a.m. policy, all these things, that relationship was severed. And there were even groups of people after that time that tried to keep that sort of fire on the landscape. At the time they called it light burning. But as the sort of Forest Service and government apparatus developed to prevent fire, that was viewed as bad. Science was suppressed, studies were rigged. There's a paper, they called light burning so-called Paiute forestry in this very derogatory way to associate indigenous practices with sort of like this barbaric stuff, which was real messed up. And that leads us to this era in which we got today. So fire suppression is one of several causes of the suppression, of the predicament we're in today. And we break it down in sort of three main causes. So there's suppression, which means that we've had for 100 years, fires haven't happened. In a lot of, especially like lower and mid-elevation ponderosa pine forest, fire would have happened every roughly 10 to 30 years. And so there are ecosystems across the country where that hasn't happened. Now we have tons of growth in that, just what we might call a buildup of fuel or stuff that can burn. And so when it burns big, and it's much harder to control. But that's not the case in all ecosystems. But at the same time, we're dealing with two other major factors, one of which we've talked about a little bit, that Amy talked about, is climate change. So as things are getting warmer, we have less snowpack, we have snow that would have fallen in spring coming as rain, washing things away. We have something called vapor pressure deficit, which is kind of the rate at which moisture is sponged out of the air, escalating. We have more hours of the day in which fire can be severe. All these factors conflagrate to create these huge conflagrations. And we also have more people than ever moving to what's called the wildland-urban interface, which we have another cool illustration. So this is basically the area where people live among flammable stuff. And we have a lot of that in Park County. Yeah. And that's something we want to sort of localize this conversation as well. So as more people develop, there's sort of two things happening at once. We have people with means moving to areas that are aesthetically appealing, especially mountainous areas, or often non-mountainous areas, because grass fires are a real deal too, and to sort of pursuing that natural wonder of the world and not thinking a lot about the things that can affect you in those wonderful natural spaces. And in other areas, we also have people pushed out of city centers by escalating costs of living. You know, there in many communities, there's the saying, drive till you can afford. And because when there's less zoning, less ordinances, it can be cheaper to live as well. And much harder to get out in the event of an emergency. And there are less things that are keeping you safe in those areas. So it's not just rich people living in the WUI. Fire is an environmental justice issue as well. So fire suppression, climate change, and development into the WUI are really what's driving how we got here.
And that notion about the WUI and starting to dig into the WUI led us to kind of a key insight into how we might move forward as a society. And that is the notion of how a home actually ignites. We met with a retired Forest Service scientist, Jack Cohen, and he told us about this concept, or he told us about his experience as a fire scientist, and he just kept studying fires, and this was throughout the 80s in Southern California primarily, and he just noticed these fire scenes where he was seeing a disconnect between the movement of the fire and the destruction of homes. Homes being destroyed by fire are far away from the fiery front. Yet we are often presented with this notion in the media that, flames overtake a home and burn it to the ground. Jack's research over the years revealed that the most likely cause of a home ignition is a floating ember that can come from, up to miles away from the fire. Find a weak spot in your home, a clogged gutter, some debris next to your house, a tree that's up against your roof. Anything that can burn that's touching your home can lead to a home ignition. And once the fire takes hold of your home, then you have a source of ignition in a neighborhood, and it can spread from home to home. So if you look at pictures from like Paradise, California, for example, you can see just these hardly vaporized foundations in homes that are no longer there, yet there's trees that are sort of barely singed nearby. And so that insight tells us we don't necessarily have a wildfire problem, we have a home ignition problem. And there are maybe ways that we can protect our homes and our communities from fire. We can design our communities better, put them in the right places, where we build, how we build. That became a central focus of the book. I'm glossing over some of the in-between, but I think that was a powerful insight in not only helping us develop Fireline, but also this book as well.
Yeah, and to really sort of expand on that, it's so easy to think when we hear about fire, we hear about fire that is destructive. We hear about Lahaina, we hear about the Yukon, we hear about these fires that are destroying communities, and the message is put out the fire. And in some cases that's right. In some cases the message is there are fires that should be put out. But if the solution, if fire is truly so bad that we cannot, we've learned fire is a symptom of our own hubris in a lot of ways. We thought we could control fire and we cannot. And so we have to, if we recognize that we have limits in our control of nature, instead can change how we live, that's liberating. That gives us agency in how we can solve this problem. And those solutions mean, one, we can live differently with fire. That means we can design our homes differently. So this illustration by Jesse shows one side of a house that's not retrofitted for fire, another side of it is, and the side on the left, you have a bunch of trees close together, you have some firewood close to the house, you have a wood roof. It's probably harder to see, but there might be eaves and soffit openings and gutters loaded with leaves. On the right side, you have much more nicely spaced trees, you have a metal roof, you have, sort of this more flammable stuff farther away from your house. There are these really basic things you can do, some of which cost money, some of which is pretty low-hanging fruit, it's not that hard to push the pine needles out of your gutter. It is much harder to change your roof. But at the same time, that we need to, if we can learn that as a community, as individuals and community members, we can work together to live better with fire, that means we can also tolerate more fire of the right kind and in the right place, which is something that we need to get our landscape back in balance, to, like Jeanette said, rejuvenate so many areas of the landscape that we take for granted is just looking to what, a lot of the forests we see are not healthy forests, but because they're what we've known, we take for granted that they're healthy, and that's how a forest should look. So we have to push through, a century's worth of these notions that we've internalized to get through this. And so the solutions aren't easy, but they're there. And ultimately, that's what we wanted this book to be, is a book that offers solutions and offers agency to both individuals and communities.
Yeah, and thinking through the fire suppression regime and that passage I read in the beginning, fire seasons are 80 days longer than they were 30 years ago. Are there any firefighters in the room tonight? Yeah, so thank you. And the reality is...
Well, I did it as a journalist for 10 years, but I was carded.
Okay, so you were in it. You were in harm's way.
I did it a lot, yeah.
And what we're asking of these young men and women is simply too much. The job was initially conceived as a summer job for many folks. It was a way to kind of earn some money in the off season, you ski in the winter. We talked to many firefighters that over the last 20 years, they started in the job in that way, and now it's a full year job. And the amount of strain that puts on the people that are in harm's way, day after day, year after year, with very little rest, it takes a toll on the body, takes a toll on the mind, takes a toll on the family. And we've also, along with that, also developed this expectation in our society that fires will be put out. Right? So we expect the firefighters to do the job. The job is getting harder because it's longer, but also the fires are getting harder and harder to control, if not impossible. So we developed this really outstanding militarized core of outstanding folks, but we're just asking too much of them. It's past the breaking point. Right? And so that's another theme of the book. It's like what we're doing is clearly not working. We're putting too much pressure on people in the system. Not only people that live in the WUI like we've talked about, but the people actually doing the firefighting as well. It's taken a big toll. We get into some of the research on mental health, suicide, and so forth in the firefighting corps. And on a positive note, some of the things the Forest Service and other agencies are doing to change their ways and try to provide better services and care for these folks that are doing this hard job.
Yeah, and I want to shift gears just a little bit. So you guys might be, a lot of you are probably very familiar with some of the issues with wildfire. But, one thing that, this is the first talk I've given in Livingston, which is where I live. And wildfire is an issue here. And it's one that we often just talk about in terms of oh shit, there's going to be smoke, and that sucks. And when there's not a fire and there's not smoke, we forget about it. Which is kind of why I'm grateful we're doing this on a super snowy day, on our first wintry day, because this fire is something we should be thinking about and talking about around the year. And, it was interesting when we started the podcast with Justin. Justin lives in the WUI in Missoula. And in Missoula, they're not to say that these organizations are perfect, there's a lot of things to go, but they're people that will come out and assess your property and be like, hey, this is what you need to do better. And, it sounds like there are regulations and things as well. Out here, there's not so much. And so I want to start a conversation about Livingston and what can we do better to live with fire? Where can we and can we not tolerate wildfire? And what can we do better as a community to talk about it? And so I kind of want to open it up to you all to help localize this conversation, because we want this book to be a resource to communities.
So Nick, before we do that, can I put you on the spot with a question?
Yeah.
Could a fire like the Marshall Fire or Lahaina happen here in Livingston?
If there was community spread meaning house-to-house spread. So if, for example, like Jack Cohen told us, embers are floating off a fire, or there's a grass fire, and there's a hell of a lot of grass around. Now also pushing fires onto homes, it absolutely could. We're not immune to that stuff just because it seems like, Livingston Peak is a few miles away. In fact, there's a fire right there. Those embers could easily reach us in town.
Yeah, we asked at the Climate Summit, we asked the panel, including Kimmy Barrett, Livingston residents who works on wildfire risk mitigation, the folks from the fire department. We asked them the same question, and blanket answer was yes, it's not if, it's when it happens to a community like this in Montana.
Wendy.
Well, one thing I might add to that, some of the work we were doing post-flood around flood hazard mitigation and working with the county, we learned that Park County does not have an evacuation plan in place for flood or fire.
Yeah, it's not
They
great.
haven't had the time or the capacity at the fire department to put that together. And that should scare the shit out of our community.
I've only been here a couple times, but it doesn't seem like there's many ways in and out of town.
Yeah, especially the north side. I think that's super concerning about a grass fire starting in the north side of town. There's 2 crossings, well, 3 crossings. 1 crossing if there's a railroad, train on the tracks. It's a big,
Yeah, when we drove up, I drove over from home here tonight, and there was a rail train on the tracks, and there was a big line of cars waiting to get out from the underpass. Yeah.
We also put the hospital on the other side of the river from the community.
Yep.
Emergency, that's not.
Also a train on the tracks next to some real dry grass.
There sure is. And one thing to point out too about, the big burn in 1910, it wasn't just, Smoky Bear messages, campfires running amok. It was in large part fueled by our growing industrial economy. It was fueled by trains. It was dozens and dozens of fires across the West as trains were segmenting the country, spitting out sparks, starting fires. We're a town built for fire. It's going to happen. And we have a lot of great community organizations, and the flood was definitely a wake-up call in a lot of ways. But we don't want disaster to happen for us to start thinking about these issues. And it does also, another message is that it doesn't have to come from our county commission or city managers or anything like that. Change can come from the ground up. And we can start organizing and talking about these things and working together to help each other be more safe as well.
So, we watched the Marshall Fire start.
Where they're
And-
driving.
And what caused the change in Colorado for where we have a house there is the fact that insurance will no longer cover you if you haven't done fire-wise things. So that's another avenue.
Yeah, and that's actually, and part of that, so there's been some innovative solutions in Boulder County in particular where there's a group of Wildfire partners who, their goal is to reach everybody in the county, to get them to retrofit if they're living in fire-prone areas. And a part of what they negotiated deals with the insurance companies to say, if you do this work, we'll give you a discount, and we'll just cover you in the first place. And I imagine there are parts of Montana that are experiencing that same thing, but it's not hitting us in the same way yet. But that's likely just a matter of time. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of unburned forest still down in the valley, Pine Creek area, the Sioux Creek area where I hike all the time, and then also I hike down Deep Creek where it's burned through. But if that was really to get going with a lot of wind from the south, and there was a blow up, as you well know what it is, and we have a column of 30,000 feet, smoke going up or whatever, that could easily throw embers deep into the west side here.
Oh yeah.
And like our house is built in 1905 or something. There's so many houses on the west side are just ready to go up. Luckily, insurance companies make sure that you're not supposed to have shake roofs anymore and that kind of stuff. That can help. But it could happen here. You get our house on the corner of Lewis and 8th. If it went up, the whole block would go. Especially if the fire department was stretched in other places. So it's just a question of hopefully that wouldn't happen, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, and like I said, these solutions can come from the ground up, and they need to come from the ground up. They also need to come in the form of investment and zoning and codes and regulations, which is a dirty word here in Park County for a lot of folks. But a lot of the stuff that needs to happen costs money, and most of us don't have money to spend on a metal roof or on even just thinning out the vegetation in your yard or creating what's called defensible space. We have to have state and local and federal investment in all that work to be able to live sustainably with fire and just to be safe in this era we're in.
How does writing this book and looking at illustrations like this change the way that you think about driving around Park County? Like if you're driving up Mine or something, or
Absolutely. I mean, so one, I would say hiking around, if you're in a really overgrown forest, at least for me, I'm like, oh shit, this thing's ready. If this went, it'd be bad news, just like Tom was saying. Or this would go up big or just burn really fast. And especially with new development in the valley, it's easy to look at that like, this is a stupid place to build. Sometimes for multiple reasons, sometimes for flooding as well as fire. But yeah, it's tough in the city because so much of the city is older, and this is, in a lot of ways, it's safer to be in the city because you're not, unless you're on the north side or in the wine glass or, where many of us are. You're not necessarily among the tall grass and this stuff that can catch. But looking all around, looking all over the valley, it's really tough. And, another piece of this puzzle too that we could get into, that is a whole big can of worms that we dived a little bit into in the book, is logging and the impact of thinning and logging on wildfire, which if people have questions about it, I'd be happy to dive into. But I'd love to hear more from you about questions about fire here or fire more generally, and absolutely.
How about fire intensity with the bigger fires? They're more intense. What kind of research is out there in terms of like how that impacts the rejuvenation process? I know like the quicker fires and how I would imagine they used to burn more quickly, so it was more superficial and it could that rejuvenation came back more quickly. But with these hotter fires and the hydrophobic ash layers that end up being on the surface of the soil.
It's a real problem with high intensity fire is really interrupting the rejuvenation cycle. It's vaporizing the seed stock. Mm-hmm. So in many areas that have experienced these high intensity fires, the trees can't rejuvenate. The seed stock has been damaged, and we're not. A fire scientist at the University of Montana, Solomon Dombrowski, has told me that we actually need to start manufacturing seed stock. If we have a shortage of seed stock to rejuvenate the forests that have experienced high intensity fire, we need to replant. There's also a factor of climate change, right? Some of these fires have burned in an area we're all experiencing climate change, and so conditions on the ground might not be conducive to it growing back in the way it was before. And so, we're going to see a lot more grasslands and sagebrush and more arid types of vegetation in the place of larger trees that in certain places. It's not going to be the same across. That's one thing we've learned, is it varies from place to place to a high degree. But these high intensity fires and climate change are combining to really change the nature of the vegetation of the landscape.
I was just looking back at all the questions that the kids came up with after reading the book, and I can keep going if you want me to. But I feel like the first one that I want to ask is, are there any examples of communities that do fire well in Montana, and what do they do that's different? Or do you want to hold off on that till the end?
Yeah. No, we can definitely talk about that to an extent. Montana's tricky because Montana's behind the times in a lot of ways when it comes to the state level and many community levels. But for the podcast and the book, we did visit, across the country, actually, I should say that if we're talking about prescribed fire, which pretty much all fire scientists and the Forest Service say we need more of, though the Forest Service is doing a really, really bad job at getting more of it on the ground for a variety of reasons. Tribal communities are doing a much better job at returning fire to the landscape. So we visited the site of a prescribed fire on the Flathead Reservation and we're walked through this really nice open landscape that, the tribes had developed a forest management plan that involved not just fire suppression. They recognized that fires need to be suppressed in certain ways, but also that we need fire on the landscape. And they brought it back. This was called the Jocko Prairie. And
that's another illustration.
So in the Jocko Prairie, they thinned. So in order to sustainably do a prescribed fire, you got to get rid of a lot of that stuff that's clogging up the landscape so the fire doesn't get too big. And the fire burns lower intensity. It doesn't get up into the canopies of the tree. It starts called a crown fire. And this was a landscape rejuvenating fire. So the tribes for millennia had gathered a root called camas, which is what this illustration is. And our dog's also named Camus, unrelated, so I now have a tattoo of this on my leg. And
you gotta show us some right now.
Yeah, sure. Over here. But anyway, so nobody had seen camas in this area for a century, basically, or for decades and decades. Nobody, elders told of a time when there was camas here, but nobody had seen it. And basically the year after they brought fire back to the landscape, camas was back everywhere. And they were able to not just rejuvenate, the ecosystem, but also the knowledge that came along with that. And, the CSKT, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes are not the only tribes doing this. They're not the only tribes doing this in Montana, but it's one example of a community that's doing some really innovative and awesome stuff when it comes to wildfire. And there are communities in Montana, we should say, including Missoula, like Fire Adapt Missoula, that's doing really cool stuff when it comes to helping community members live better with fire and be prepared for fire. Justin, you could talk about that.
And so much of this is bureaucratic hurdles, too. Fire doesn't really care who owns the land, right? But the agencies care, and private landowners care. And so you have a lot of patchwork of land ownership, whether it's private land, state land, county land, Forest Service land. And so part of Missoula's efforts is to develop a system of coordination across those ownership jurisdictions to do these prescribed burns, to do thinning. It might seem like it takes an annoyingly long amount of time to pull off this sort of bureaucratic coordination, but it seems like it's probably hard work, working within these agencies to make this sort of change happen. It's going to take time. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton of time to get this work done, but we do see progress in places like Missoula. I mean, that was a tough question we got in one of our book events. The question was, hey, it seems like you've got a lot of characters in your book doing awesome work in Montana, yet your stories of communities that are doing the best work in this space are not from Montana. Why is that? And Nick illuminated some of those answers. We don't really have a good answer to that question other than we need to do better in our communities here in the state.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of space that's not in the WUI that is open to development?
But when we talk about development, wildfire is not the only issue. We have to worry about the floodplain. We have to worry about habitat. We have to worry, and there's, in this area, a lot of the land that is open is also working land. And so Park County has, for at least a while longer, a growth plan that helps.
I heard about this growth.
Helps us figure out how to grow and where to grow. And, in theory, the idea would be denser infill in the city, rather than to be sprawling outward and outward. We have to deal with more people. There will be more people living here. But we can do, the goal would be to, when we have to build outward, yes, find areas that are safe for all these various hazards. Do it in ways that doesn't damage habitat or impacts habitat as little as possible. It doesn't displace producers. But general infill is also a pretty damn good thing, too. Is that fair, Jonathan?
When you say we don't have much time, what do you mean? How do you mean about that?
Well, it seems like it takes a catastrophe for us to do much around climate change issues, and much in general, right? And so, will it take a catastrophe in Montana? In our interview with Kimmy Barrett, who's a resident of Livingston, she was talking about the Paradise Fire, thinking, gosh, if that fire, and how much media portrayal of that fire we've seen, movies, documentaries, etc. If that fire didn't really meaningfully get us to change our ways and wake up to wildfire, what's it going to take? And so these events are happening, and I'm not trying to necessarily sound the alarm, but in many ways we are. Like, it's going to happen here in Montana at some point, right? And the question is, can we do things to prevent the severity of that when it happens? And the speed of response is just not adequate. The agencies need to move faster. Citizens need to move faster. Communities need to move faster. Policies need to change. And hopefully it's not going to take a catastrophe to motivate that.
Yeah, we shouldn't have to wait for the worst case scenario to make change. And one of the sad things that we see, and we can see this to an extent too when it comes to the flood last summer here, is that when it comes to wildfires, there's often a policy window after a disaster. We can see that in Marshall Fire very well, where for a year, maybe 2 years after, people are willing to make change and make change at the policy level. but then people forget, and people go about living their lives, and they get other concerns on their plate, and that's understandable in a lot of ways. But that disaster that could happen could still happen again, and so that moment for change passes away. That is opened after this immense tragedy. And we shouldn't have to wait for that moment. We shouldn't have to capitalize on that moment. We shouldn't have to allow these disasters in the first place. We should get ahead of them.
So this book came out like days after the fire in Lahaina. And a question we got often in our talks about the book was about the so-called miracle house in Lahaina. I don't know if any of you have seen the image of it, but it's a pretty stark image of a white house with a red metal roof, recently installed metal roof, and it had, I don't know if they knew about Firewise when they did the landscaping, but there was very little vegetation around the home. And there's just pictures all over the popular press of this home amidst just vaporized foundations all around it. And questions of, images like that can maybe break through. Oh yeah, maybe like how we build a home can have an influence on its survivability. It certainly can. And images like that, or the fact that the East Coast was blanketed by smoke for large parts of the early summer from the Canada fires, maybe that creates a sort of window of opportunity. At least it raises the salience of the issue to folks that maybe haven't thought of it before. So it gives me some optimism that folks will get on board.
Well, the Pine Creek fire was a big wake-up call for this community.
Yeah.
And that was a big wake-up call
When was that?
for a lot of reasons.
2012, I think, is that right?
Yeah.
13?
And, when they look back on it, there were a lot of people that were telling the residents there in that drainage where it really took off. There was a lot of juniper in there. And a lot of people were saying, man, there's a lot of juniper in there. And that's I don't know if you've ever seen juniper burn, but it's just like turpentine on these things.
Yeah.
And so, with that southwest wind, and that's, what they call a chimney going up there, that got going, and it came roaring up into Pine Creek. It caught a couple houses on the way, got into town, and I think, luckily, our rural fire department, Babcock on it, I happen to know from working on a lot of fires, he's done a lot with Type 1, and the Rocky Mountain crews, and all of that. So he was very plugged in to the wildfire response, and he was able to actually divert some helicopters and a tanker that had just left the West Yellowstone base with retardant, and they came in and laid retardant down all over, for years there was still retardant on the church. You could see the orange on it. But if that hadn't happened, you probably would have lost everything there.
Yeah.
But that was, a spark from a backhoe, on some rocks at the end of August, and when everyone thought, oh, we're kind of out of it, well, we weren't, So, I know ranchers, some friends that were ranchers are after that one of his hobbies is taking his tractor and pulling up juniper. Around his ranch, because it was just obvious this stuff it take off.
Yeah.
That makes me wonder how many rural communities have fire departments or volunteer fire departments that have wildfire expertise or experience in fighting wildfires versus regular domestic household fire type fires.
There are a lot. We don't have numbers on that. But especially in rural communities, wildfire is a part of daily life. Like out on, ranchers are often used to dealing with fires on their property and putting them out themselves. So I don't have numbers on that for you. But we do have, in Montana, a lot of rural communities are very used to and equipped for wildfire. And we also have, there are a lot of issues with why we put out the fires we put out and where we put out the fires we put out as a society. But we do have a very rapid response that has formed in a very military-like way almost across the country, where you mentioned Type 1 fires, the biggest kind of fire, where you're mobilizing forces from across the country, or you have obviously you're like county firefighters, you have private firefighters, you have state, you have people from across the country, sometimes international, all in this giant fire camp, mobilizing in like that. It's crazy how it happens that fast. But yeah, to me, the solution isn't just getting better at putting out fire. It's learning how to live better with fire and which kind of fires we can tolerate. I imagine we're getting close to time here, though I don't know. So I think what we should do is I'll read a short little thing at the very end of the book. Hopefully this doesn't spoil anything for you, and then we'll wrap it up. So again, this is the end. In the end of the book, we ask you to imagine what our future with fire looks like. What communities will look like. And we've talked with you throughout about the need for more fire and thinking differently about fire. So I'll start here. This requires a change so much deeper than just policy. We just don't have a culture of having fire. We have a culture of not having fire, Mark Finney of Forest Service Research Forester says. So when it comes to trying to change that, you're overturning generations of belief. Changing beliefs means changing culture. It means changing ideology. And overturning a whole ideology is a daunting task. But there's an optimism in the work that lies ahead. Lamia Quinn Davidson calls the small networks of prescribed burning associations popping up across the West a social movement. That's because it is. Those burners are thinking of fire in new ways. And those groups, along with tribes across the country, scientists, even some Forest Service employees, are paving a new path for fire. Combined, there's a groundswell forming. The change needed to shift culture will always come from the ground up, not the top down. It will come from folks like you, from communities like this one. In this way, doing the work that's crucial to saving your own home and community is a revolutionary act. Getting a new roof, installing 1/8-inch eave vents, and pruning and cutting trees and shrubs to create defensible space are downright radical. So is calling for more fire on the landscape near your home rather than less. And of course, organizing your neighbors. That's because learning to live with fire requires learning to live better with one another. And that pays off. It plants the first planks of a bridge to a better world for so much more than just wildfire. Living better with one another is especially important because the generations of belief that need overturning aren't just related to wildfire. Lessening the severity of wildfires also requires reducing our emissions. That, like changing our relationship with flames, requires shifts in both policy and collective action, and in individual values. In this way, changing our relationship with wildfire is part of a much bigger project, changing our relationship with the world around us. The work ahead will not be easy, but we can do it. We have to.